This is possibly the most insidious, possibly the most potent, and possibly the most dangerous form of communalism. हर घर भगवा छाएगा, राम राज्य फिर आएगा, एक ही नारा एक ही नाम, जय श्री राम जय श्री राम. Where if you're a Hindu, you're an Indian. If you're not a Hindu, you're an outsider. What did the rhetoric in Myanmar do? Films like Kashmir Files and Kerala Story became so popular was that the diaspora was so prominent in propping these films up.
Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Nous interviews. Today we have a very exciting guest with us who has written a very exciting book. Kunal is an independent journalist. He's a documentary filmmaker, podcaster, writer, wears a lot of hats. And he has written this very intriguing and compelling book called H-Pop, The Secretive World of Hindutva Pop Stars. Now, Kunal's work is basically looking at Hindu radicalization in the sphere of popular culture, particularly looking at the Hindi-speaking belt in India. I'm going to jump right in. I have a lot of questions for you, Kunal. And my first question for you is to at a place where your journey begins. So you open your book by talking about the incident in Gumla, Jharkhand. That is sort of like a place that introduces you to this world of Hindutva popular culture. And then you see how, that it actually exists at a very large scale across the Hindi-speaking belt. So can you introduce us to that world and how did you, sort of stumble upon it?
Firstly, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure, and I'm glad to be, a part of this conversation because I believe that the work that you're doing is extremely important.
Thank you.
So my best wishes to you and the team.
I really appreciate that.
As you said, the book really is talking and is a bit of a window into the world that we don't really know too much about. What we've seen in all of these years is a radicalization of the Hindu community. What we've seen is instances of violence. What we've seen is instances of the outcome of that radicalization. What we haven't seen is the process behind the radicalization, is the process that drives some of that radicalization. And unfortunately, in our conceptualization of what is happening in the country right now, we tend to treat communalism as some sort of an event, which it isn't. We tend to sort of think of them as aberrations that come out of nowhere. But the truth is slightly more complicated. The truth is that there is a build-up of hate that finally results in the violence. The violence is the outcome. It's not the event. It's not the end of it. And that is the shift that this book is trying to bring to people's attention, that we need to be focusing a lot more on the process of building up. So what I'm trying to do in this book is really to talk about how we've reached a point of everyday communalism where people are being polarized. They're being told to fear and to be angry at others within the country. And the slow process of doing this through popular culture. We've always, we tend to associate popular culture with entertainment. We tend to associate it with some sort of a very benign purpose to it, except that in this case, popular culture has been weaponized. And the idea always is to sort of ensure that this anti-Muslim bias that has existed in people's minds becomes a bit of a permanent occurrence. It doesn't then only remain restricted from event to event. And that is what the book is really looking at. I came across this sort of world of Hindutva Pop and Hindutva Pop Stars when I was in Jharkhand tracking a hate crime that had happened. And I was there in 2018 and the hate crime had happened before that. And sort of just the idea of looking at that hate crime was not just to look at the violence that had happened, but to understand the process behind it. And what I saw was that the day the hate crime had happened was the day of Ram Navami, which for anyone who knows Jharkhand, it's a massive occasion. It's the biggest festival of the state. And then one of the things that I noticed was that on that particular day of the instance, the procession that comes to the Jama Masjid of Gumla is a small town in Jharkhand, not too far from Ranchi. On that particular day, and this has been a syncretic tradition of sorts, where the Ramnavami procession will enter the lane where the Jama Masjid is. It will come right in front of the Jama Masjid. The local Muslims would gather. They would welcome the processionists. They would offer refreshments. They would, they would shower petals. So there would be that sort of tradition followed, and then the procession would go ahead from there. Except that that particular day, when the procession comes close, there's a different energy in the crowd. The crowd is rather boisterous. They're rather aggressive and assertive. And in trying to understand why that was the case, when I tried to reinvestigate it and speak to eyewitnesses, what I realized was that something had changed in that procession, and the thing that had changed from all of the previous years to that year was that particular year they played music. They flipped on a song whose words were to the effect, Mulle ki topi gira do. And the result of this was that the local Muslims who had gathered, the local Hindus who had gathered, businessmen and so on, they were all shocked and aghast because this is something that Jharkhand and Gumla especially had never seen. The fact that songs could be having such provocative words. And so very quickly in that moment, the police diffuse the situation. The police tell the procession to switch off the music, and the procession goes ahead. But what happens is some of the people who were a part of the procession, so sort of driven by those passions and by those sentiments, when they're going back home a few hours after that, just 2 or 3 kilometers away from the spot of the Jama Masjid, they see a Muslim boy and a Hindu girl talking to each other, and in their head they see that as love jihad. They knew the Muslim boy, they knew his family, they knew him personally, but they forget all of that. And they drag him out, they tie him to an electric pole, and they beat him till he drops dead. And that's the hate crime that I had gone to cover. Now, if I had focused only on that instance, we would have not understood the backstory. But the backstory in this case for me was extremely significant in being able to understand the possible motivations of those who were lynching Mohammed Shalik. He's the 20-year-old who died. So this is my, this was my first-hand experience of what popular culture, which is sort of propaganda really, it can do to people, what it can arouse in them, and the very real life effects of this kind of pop culture.
So just going off of the link that you're sort of trying to draw or understand or trace from the violence to so the song that was playing, so the popular culture that's around. A lot of times when we are talking about Hindu radicalization, especially in the public discourse, it is often sort of brushed under the carpet by calling it the fringe, or there are a couple of extreme elements on the peripheries, and they're the ones who are calling for violence. But you talk about a certain everydayness to this popular culture. So, is this the popular culture that you have encountered in your work? Is this the fringe, or is this the everyday mainstream?
No, this is very much the everyday mainstream. I think what we're seeing now is a shift in the form of communalism. Till a few years ago, the communalism that we used to witness was the one which needed big riots, which needed big instances to polarize communities. From there we shifted to instances where you needed a mob lynching, you needed smaller clashes. The next stage of this, which is the stage that we're living through now, is that you don't need any of this. What you need is communalism on free flow. It's almost like communalism on tap, on demand. That communalism is now so much steeped into the everyday that you can be consuming essentially hate speech on demand, but through music, but through poetry, and but through books. So you no longer need to be participating in a political event at all. All you need to do is just be, wanting to be entertained in the confines of your home sometimes, right? Or when you're driving to work or so on. So all you need to do is now consume a song or consume a poetry or read a book to be influenced by the exact same rhetoric, or sometimes even worse, that you would encounter in a political rally. So what this has done is this has really made communalism an everyday event where it can continuously just play in the background 24/7, 365 days without there being any sense of accountability to it. It's so insidious that it's very difficult to track who are the people who are really behind this, what is the impact of this, because it's playing in the background. It's not an event anymore. If there's a hate speech, it's easier to track. If there's a riot, it's easier to investigate. But when it's just, this tune playing in the backdrop, which is happening constantly, who do you really, sort of hold accountable for that tune, or who do you really, ask to stop that? So we're seeing that this is possibly the most insidious, possibly the most potent, and possibly the most dangerous form of communalism, because we're no longer, understanding that what we're essentially consuming is propaganda and hate speech. We continue to believe that this is just pop culture that is meant to entertain us.
Also, how ubiquitous it is. It's everywhere.
It is everywhere.
It's in the cars that you're driving. And,
Whenever I would travel, I would see that this kind of music that especially I talk about, the music would be on people's phones as their caller tunes. I remember when I was covering the Gumla instance, the person who was driving me around and I had taken a car.
You mentioned that in the book.
I mentioned that in the book as well, right? I drive with him for about 2 weeks. And his caller tune was a song called Har Ghar Bhagwa Chhayega, Ram Raj Fir Aayega, Ek Hi Nara, Ek Hi Naam, Jai Shri Ram, Jai Shri Ram. And then it goes on to list the Hindutva agenda, So this is the everydayness of it. You don't necessarily see that as a political act at all. You think it's just a caller tune, or you think it's just a ringtone. So it's that which is making it so much more difficult to track and difficult to understand as a form of somewhat organized propaganda.
You were looking at you've sort of narrowed down 3 different characters across 3 different forms of popular culture. So can you tell us what is the logic of picking each character, and are there any unifying trends or patterns that you've observed? If you can say that okay, these are the core features of Hindutva popular culture.
Right. So essentially what I did was, as I said, I started off with trying to understand what Hindutva music was doing. And then I realized that the story doesn't end there, right? It's not music alone that has been weaponized. Since then, I sort of started looking at other forms of popular culture genres. And I saw that poetry had actually suffered a somewhat similar fate, where poetry had also been weaponized. Similarly, the world of publishing also, saw the same, where we were now seeing Hindutva publishing to be emerging as a bit of a niche, a bit of a subgenre within publishing as well. So, what I try to do is try to look at it through the lives of one sort of cheerleader or one pop star each, who is creating that genre of popular culture and is rather prolific at it. So the first character in the book is this woman from Haryana. Her name is Kavi Singh. Essentially, she's in her mid-20s, and she has never sung before till 2019, till the Pulwama terror attack happens. And if you remember, it was possibly the worst terror attack in peacetime on our paramilitary forces. We were all angry. We were all outraged at the fact that this has happened. But Kavi decides to view that through a very different lens, and her lens is that let's not blame Pakistan, which was popularly believed to be behind the terror attack. Let's not blame the suicide bomber who actually caused the terror attack. Let's blame the people living amongst us. And by which she implied Muslims, but especially Kashmiri Muslims. And so that song, sort of makes her a viral sensation. And then since then, she's been singing all kinds of songs on every major occasion in the Hindu right wing to be celebrated or to be recorded. So right from the recent Ram temple to the abrogation of Article 370, through the anti-CAA protests, where she brings out a song which is essentially saying, guys, look what's happening. These people are taking over our streets. What we need to now do is control their population. So she brings a song called Population Control Law. And then the song really just talks about that. So that's the singer, Kavi Singh. Similarly, there's the second character in the book is a young man who is in his early 30s. His name is Kamal Agne. He hails from a small town outside of Lucknow. And his poetry again is touching very similar subjects as Kavi's does, but his range is broader in the sense that one of the pet projects that Kamal has undertaken is to revisit history and to look at history from a Hindutva lens. So what he does very well is that he draws these binaries and he pits one historical character against the other. So one of his poems is titled Chandrasekhar Ko Kya Mila, where he pits Chandrasekhar against a Gandhi and a Nehru, saying Chandrasekhar was killed for fighting for the country.
But he's not on your notes.
But he's not on your
Gandhi
notes at
is.
all, right? And why is Gandhi on your notes? And he says कि चंद्रशेखर आजाद इतने ही छोटे थे तो उनको 10 रुपए की नोट पे लेते. Why is Gandhi on the 10 rupee note? One of the other works that he's done is a whole poem on Gandhi. And sort of the last lines of the poem will tell you a lot about what the poem is. It really sort of celebrates in some ways Gandhi's assassination. It calls it necessary, and it also validates and legitimizes that act of violence. The last line in the poem is अगर गोडसे की गोली उतरी ना होती सीने में हर हिंदू पढ़ता नमाज फिर मक्का और मदीने में. Essentially, he's trying to say that what happened with Gandhi was right because that's the only reason why Hindus are saved. So that's Kamal Agne, and similarly, the third character in the book is this former journalist who's now a YouTuber, who's rather popular as a YouTuber. But he started his own publishing house.
Range of stuff he's doing.
He's doing so many different things, right? He has his own e-commerce website where he only sells things that a Hindu household would want to use. He also has his publishing house where he's selling various titles. He's selling more than 25,000 books a year, and almost always on subjects close to the Hindutva, sort of part. So he's trying to, create different ways to carry the Hindutva message forward. So these are the three people who I've looked at. In terms of the commonalities, I think one of the things that I found very interesting was that they were all in some ways, ideologically committed to the project. In terms of just their commitment to speaking the message, especially for a Sandeep Dev, who's not really found the journey very rewarding.
And also has sort of disassociated with the BJP.
He's dissociated because he feels the BJP is not strong enough on the matter of Hindutva. But they're all sort of the common link to all of them is that they're all engaged in trying to utilize the skills that they have to further the message that they firmly believe in. And sort of that calls for some sort of innovation, that calls for dedication on their part because you like their message or no, but they're committed to it and they're continuously sort of working to spread the message of Hindutva. And so that I see as a common link that sort of ties all of them together.
So when we are drawing like the commonality of like Hindutva principles across these three characters, what I'm interested to understand is that they seem fairly individual, characters and stories, and not like maybe associated with say like larger system or a party or whatever. But a lot of what that the larger project that they're doing, that they're contributing towards, work for that is happening at a systemic level right now in the country. So even though, of course, like they might be cooperate for say like one political event where like a Kamal is doing a poetry at a political rally or whatever, but he's not like maybe say formally like in the party, but is actively contributing to the larger project of Hindutva. So my question is that how do we understand that, they look like pretty individual stories and characters, but how do we understand that as a systemic change and, work that is happening at a systemic level? Like, how do we understand it as, something that's happening collectively?
I think the answer is at two levels. One level is that all of these people, all of the three, and that broader genre of pop culture that I'm talking about, which is Hindutva pop culture, is a product of our times. It wouldn't exist if not for the levels of polarization that we've already seen, right? It wouldn't exist if Hindutva ideology was not so normalized. It wouldn't exist if there was such broad support for a lot of the biases that Hindutva inherently carries and tries to perpetuate. So they're all products of that period in time where we're seeing all of this getting normalized. But the other part is that they're also actively playing their part in furthering that project. They might be individual actors with a great degree of agency, where and where they're not necessarily people who've been orchestrated or paid to do some of this work, right? But they're products of the time, and they're also doing their bit in furthering that project that they all belong to. So the idea always is for them to take the Hindutva project ahead no matter what. And that becomes a very key element of their existence, because once they stop doing that, they stop being as relevant as they are to the ecosystem today. So they understand that for them to be relevant, for them to be a significant player in the ecosystem, for them to be getting the kind of popularity that they're getting, it's important to continuously stay relevant and to continuously reinvent the message. So what happens is the broader cultural project of Hindutva can't only stand on say Muslim bashing, right? So you constantly feel the need to invent new enemies as well. You constantly need to go back and, sometimes it involves going back into history. So sometimes it will mean a poetry on Gandhi, for instance, and looking at him through a Hindutva lens. Sometimes it will talk about, perceived injustices to other freedom fighters.
But even when they're speaking about Gandhi, it's because he was a Muslim appeaser.
A Muslim appeaser, yeah.
So then there is some tying up of
Absolutely. So it always has to flow right back into what the core agenda is. But I'm saying that it can't always only be, holding
maybe different
the Muslim
ways
up.
of coming at.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand that. Is it even when they're coming through Gandhi, it is coming to like an anti-Muslim rhetoric?
Always. So even when they're talking of Article 370, Kavi had a song as soon as Article 370 was abrogated. Kavi released a song, and one of the lines in the song really tell you what the broader celebration was. The lines were, "Ab Kashmir ki ghati mein Jai Shri Ram ke naare goonjenge," right? So it was seen as a triumph of the Hindu will in India's only Muslim majority state. So the idea is always the same. The idea is always, appealing to the core narrative, the core ideology of Hindutva, but it has to be through different means in messaging, because how much can you keep saying the same thing? So even when they attack a JNU, for instance, it will always again go back to their core beliefs, that Muslims, that the left, that communists are all attacking India and are all anti-Hindus, and hence we must fight against them.
So there is always that. It really just I'm trying to understand if it really just comes down to the self and the other, where the Hindu is the self and the Muslim is the other.
Yeah. So look, the othering can't happen unless you create a sense of self and a sense of belonging within the people that you want to appeal to, right? So you talk of a shared set of values. You talk of a shared sort of existence. You talk of a shared civilization that you believe existed before all of these invaders came. And then by doing that, when you create your own community, is when you find it so easy to then other anyone who doesn't belong to the community. But the act of creating the community also is exclusionary, because the benchmarks that you set for what that community is inherently exclusionary. So all of this, the creating of the community is a sense of othering, but also then the very obvious othering happens at the next level. So at all levels, it always is about attacking the core enemies of Hindus, and then Muslims being one. But then the list sort of then sometimes goes on and on, because let's also remember that for this pop culture to be relevant, they need the creation of newer and newer enemies. Otherwise, it's a bit like what we're seeing with Pakistan in Bollywood. How many films can you make which only and only bash Pakistan? The recent film that we saw, Fighter, where again there's a lot of Pakistani bashing. It doesn't work. So then you need to make a film like a Kashmir Files. Then you need to make a film like a Kerala Story. Where you are shifting the gaze a bit, and you're now targeting people within the country itself. And in the same way, the Hindutva right wing has to create newer and newer enemies for it to stay relevant to people.
But in all of that, we see that the otherization of the Muslim then
is very prominent. It's
is
extremely
like the
prominent.
commonality that is, regardless of where it is, whether it's a domestic enemy or an international enemy.
Absolutely.
It really comes down to the Muslim figure or the Muslim body.
Yeah, so one of the things that I noticed when I was, traveling with Kamal, for instance, is that this is just after the Lakhimpur Kheri instance, when farmers were sort of killed by a car which contained the son of a union minister. And amidst all of the outrage, just days after the instance, Kamal gives a whole sort of performance in UP, but doesn't mention a word about the instance. Instead, what he mentions is how Americans have left Afghanistan and Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. And look how terrible Muslims are, that their own Muslim brothers and sisters are wanting to leave the country and fly off. So he talks of how if you allow Muslims here to get away with what they're doing, one day Hindus will have to try and escape the country like the Afghanis are at this point.
Yeah. And he also brings that conversation back to India, where he's just like, but we have more Talibans here.
Absolutely.
Than there are in
Yeah.
Afghanistan.
So the idea is to draw in to these different instances and different events that are happening across us, but then again bring them back to the core sort of messaging, which, as I said, is to make this anti-Muslim bias in our minds permanent, and not having to rely on an event to stoke that bias. Not having to rely on a riot or a hate speech or anything, but to just create this sort of anti-Muslim bias which is permanent. So every time you encounter a Muslim, the first thing that you think of is what they've told you to think of. And not treat that person on a human level, but to think of that through the lens of Hindutva. So that essentially is the larger project.
Going back to some of the formats that you're looking at, and there's something that you mentioned in the book where you talk about music and emotional violence, and you talk about so if you can just sort of take us through the idea of like how does music help, say, make violence seem more acceptable?
I think there's been substantial experience that we've had as a society, not just in India but abroad, of looking at what popular culture and especially music, as you said, does to the human psyche, right? And yet I don't think we've seemed to understand or comprehend it fully. We're not able to grasp the power of music, but just look at the past, look at the recent past also. Look at the Rwandan genocide of 1994. One of the people who were convicted for the genocide was a guy who was a very popular singer in Rwanda. He was known as Michael Jackson, the Michael Jackson of Rwanda in those times. And one of the things that he did was that he was constantly creating songs which were songs of Hutu supremacy against the Tutsis, right? Songs that spoke about how what was needed is to exterminate all of the Tutsis, is to basically for Hutus to survive, is to be engaging in mindless violence against the Tutsis. So when the commission sat and sort of looked at war crimes, he was convicted of incitement of violence because it was found and it was investigated that the songs that were continuously played on the radio
played like an active role.
Played a very active role in fomenting hate and sort of driving people towards violence. We saw something similar happen not very far away from India in Myanmar.
I think I just wanted the follow-up question.
Yeah.
We definitely.
With the Rohingya Muslims and honestly, the rhetoric that we saw in Myanmar is very similar to the rhetoric that we see here.
Can you give us an example?
So some of the songs carried the rhetoric that you can be a Myanmaris only if you're a Buddhist. Right? To be a Buddhist is to be a Myanmaris, and to be a Myanmaris is to be a Buddhist. Very similar to what we're seeing here, where if you're a Hindu, you're an Indian. If you're not a Hindu, you're an outsider. What did the rhetoric in Myanmar do? The rhetoric in Myanmar drove Buddhists to take up weapons against the Muslims and to drive them out to commit a genocide, the effects of which we're still living through right now. So there are enough instances of how popular culture has played a very, very crucial role in dividing us as communities, in fomenting hate, and in driving people to violence. And yet we are not able to see how that can happen in a country like ours, where we're already so driven, between castes, between communities, between religions. So this is why it's important to understand the role of popular culture and role of music in today's India. Because polarization anyway is an ongoing process which doesn't automatically, it's not going to give you a result in the immediate, but it will show its effects in the medium to long term. And we shouldn't be waiting for that time to come when the effects are fully visible.
Yeah. So just two questions related to what you're speaking about. First, when the whole linkage that we're drawing between violence and popular culture, I'm very curious to know what do your characters that you have looked at and spoken and worked with think of the violence their work is causing? Like, have you had that conversation with them?
No, absolutely. I mean, we've had many of these conversations where where I did put very difficult questions to them about what their work is doing, and I think violence is a limited part of the larger sort of issue, because, as I said, violence is really the last stage of the entire process, right? But what happens before the violence actually becomes a lot more important. So I did ask them about these questions, and I think the refrain that I found from them in a very, very common manner from all of them was that we're saying what we believe in, right? We're not telling you to go and kill anyone. We're not going and telling you that you need to go and do this. What we're saying is that Hindus are in danger from all of these people, that these people are protecting their religion and they're doing what their religion tells them to do. This is their conceptualization, of course. That their religion tells them that that you need to outnumber the Hindus, that you need to kill the Kafirs, and so on. So some of the more sort of stereotypical rhetoric around Muslims and Islam. So they argue that if this is what their religion is telling them to do, the only thing that we're doing is to essentially just quote unquote awaken the Hindus to these dangers. So they tend to dissociate themselves from any effect that their work tends to have.
But see, like a poet like Kamal, he talks about when he uses that acid Ganga Jal that he's using. I mean, I'm sure he's aware that that's a very overtly violent reference to you. So, is that something that he is like consciously aware of, like as in consciously part of, like he knows what he's doing? Or, like you're saying that, they're just like, oh, we're talking about what we believe in. So
I mean, so I'm pretty certain that they know what they're doing, because they're all sort of very well cognizant of the effects that this has. But I think there are two things. One is, as I said, they don't hold themselves responsible for what people take out of their art and their content. The other thing that they believe is that essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to send a message through a form of art. We're not leading a violent mob on the streets. So they believe that, again, the role of popular culture is just to entertain, is to just tell people these things.
Even if that message is violent.
Even if that message is violent, right? In their conceptualization, it's just a song, or it's just a poetry, or it's just a book that I'm writing. I'm not leading a mob out there. I'm not knocking on people's doors. I'm not engaging in violence myself. So they tend to make a distinction between those who do that on the street and those like them who are doing this in Kavi Sammelans or in recording studios or while writing books. So that essentially is what the distinction that they try to make. My sense is, I think this is also a bit of a convenient defense mechanism that helps them, sort of also validate a lot of their own work, because they don't want to be seen essentially as people who are driving violence. They want to be seen as cheerleaders of Hindutva, as people who are, saying things that even some of the most hardline elements in the Hindutva space refrain from saying. But they want to be seen as artists who are doing that.
So is that defense mechanism for somebody like you who is an observer from the outside, or is it also for themselves?
I think essentially it's mostly for outsiders like me. I don't know if they believe in it secretly as well. But I mean, I would say, as a reporter's hunch, I would say that it is possibly a defense mechanism that allows them to get away from hard questions that someone like me would pose about their work, about their craft, and about the effects of such work that the effects that it has on people and on our society. So I would say it's mostly a mechanism for someone like me. But as I said, I mean, some of them might also be delusional to think that I have nothing more than just creating this song. And how can a song really cause violence, or how can a song lead a mob? That can't happen. So somewhere also the conceptualization. And as I said, I think one of the larger problems, Yusra, is that we don't conceptualize popular culture to be something that can be weaponized and that can lead polarization and that can lead to violence. I think we as society have to come to terms with the fact that popular culture has been weaponized before and will be weaponized in the future. So I think as long as our understanding of popular culture and its potential effects don't change, I wouldn't blame some of them to believe that it's just a song, right? Because if you go to see this popular culture, I've been tracking this for 5 years, but not a lot is known about it. It's existed even before I started tracking it, but we didn't as society we didn't really employ our resources to understand it. We didn't have the media to go and report on it. We didn't have the academic, or we didn't have the civil society to be able to engage in something like this and try and sort of understand what was happening here. So I think there's also a larger problem of our understanding, of our imagination of what popular culture can potentially lead to.
And that's interesting, because when you're talking about the processes that lead to violence, then how I'm looking at it is that, okay, then it's not just like a top-down dissemination project where you have, like the state has an ideology and that ideology is like sort of being seeped down to the ground. But there's also that certain, level of polarization, hate and prejudice that already exists on ground, which is why you would have there's a certain amount of social sanction to the violence that's happening, and there's also in certain ways a certain even celebration of violence against Muslim bodies. So how I'm understanding it is okay, it is also if you're looking at the process that leads to violence, it is not just top down, but it is also somewhere on ground. It's like a bit of both.
100%. I mean, I see hate,
social prejudice coming together with political ideology, which is very strategic and driven, and has specific goals.
But hate didn't start existing from 2014 onwards.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
just been nurtured better.
It's been nurtured better, but I think both communities, both the Hindus as well as the Muslims, have both harbored prejudices about each other. They've both carried emotional baggage about each other for many, many decades, greater than a century. Right?
Yeah.
We've also have colonial history where we've seen the two communities clashing. So we've seen that two communities which historically have had tensions between them, have had somewhat of a frayed social relationship. That sort of coexistence would happen, but it was always, sort of one step away from blowing up into something. So that was the somewhat precarious coexistence in some places of the country, more than some others, that had always existed. What has happened is, those in establishment have obviously seen this up close in their years in opposition, in their years mobilizing people on the ground for many, many decades. Right? So when they've come to power, they've understood the power of activating a lot of these biases.
Sort of politically weaponizing it for electoral gain.
And not just electoral gain. I think this is one of the lazy sort of assumptions that I want to, and a lot of people in the liberal and the progressive circles keep thinking of some of this as being motivated and as being restricted to the electoral cycle. And my argument is it's not. It's the people that I have met believe that this is a larger cultural project that they've undertaken. And even if you see what the last 10 years have brought about, they brought about a cultural shift in the way that we also perceive ourselves as a society, and in the way that the Hindus perceive themselves to be, and their relationship with the state, right? The political discourse of the country has also changed, where every party is forced to now sort of say something or stoke the sort of lines around Hinduism. You cannot ignore
there has to be some soft Hindutva somewhere.
Something that sort of is seen as an outreach to Hindus, which wasn't the case earlier. So what we're seeing is that the discourse has also changed, which is why I say that this is not necessarily only about the electoral project. In fact, some of them keep telling me that it doesn't matter to us if the BJP comes to power or no. I mean, of course, we'd like it to come to power, but for us, it's a larger cultural project where we're now finally getting a chance to voice some of the concerns that we've always harbored. So I think it would be prudent for us to look at it as something broader than restricted by electoral cycles. I think what we're seeing is a much broader project here.
then when I'm looking at the book, that you're looking at these three characters who are part of like the Hindutva project, they're sort of pushing the agenda forward in popular culture. And when we look at their lives and we see how they are, why they do what they do, how they've come at this point, and why their work is, why there's, like what drives them and all of that. It's a certain humanizing narrative, right? When we're looking at them, we're like, okay, say Kavi has XYZ challenges and obstacles in her life, and so does Kamal, and so does Sandeep, and all of that. I want to understand that how do you, as an author, as a journalist, as an observer, humanize these characters, yet able to maintain a lens of criticality, looking at the fact that they are essentially purveyors of violence, So, if you can.
So, the humanizing part was a very conscious decision going into the project, because I think one of the problems with the way that the way that society is engaged with what we're seeing with the Hindu right wing, with the Hindutva project, is to take the lazy way out, and which is to sort of demonize them, to dehumanize them sometimes, and just sort of say that these are terrible people and they're not worth engagement. I think the reality is somewhat more complex and nuanced, and needs us to be somewhat more nuanced in our understanding of things, right? One of the things that I wanted to show is that people who are cheerleaders of this hate, people who are the pop stars of this world, are not honestly very different from people like you and me. They are people who are emerging out of this exact same society. And sort of by showing the fact that they are very, very similar people, I want people to sort of understand the fact that you need to engage with what is happening. The lack of a dialogue is what has led us here. The lack of a dialogue is what has led us to a point where we're now so polarized that we're not able to understand some of the changes and some of the shifts that we're seeing in the country. Right? A lot of people, for instance, when I go with this book, are not able to understand how this pop culture even came about. And that tells you a lot about, how we're seeing things across the political aisle, how we're engaging with the most dominant political ideology of the day. So the othering is something that I wanted to avoid, because I think that just takes you, into a sort of echo chamber where you sort of just look at them as demons, you look at them as terrible people who are communal and so on and so forth. What you don't understand is some of the motivations that drive them there, right? So that's one part. The second part of it, for me as a conscious decision, was that I wanted to get into the story and get into this world without really carrying a sense of judgment, right? And for some liberals, that this is a bit jarring, because it's easy to judge people, it's easy to label them. But I think as journalists, we must be better than that. It's not our job to carry our political ideologies and our political beliefs into the reporting space, especially in times as polarized as this. I was very aware that my political leanings don't matter for much, right? I don't want to get into that space trying to change people. I didn't want to get into that space trying to convert them into believing one way or the other. I think what was way more important to the world and to society as large is a better understanding of that world. Is to be able to get into that world and tell the story that I told. And for me to be able to do that, I had to come from a place of no judgment. I had to be coming from a place where I was ready to talk to them at a human level, to be able to understand some of their problems, some of the concerns that drive them, but also ask very tough questions of them, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because except how do you also hold them accountable?
No, and I feel like I do, in the sense that I think what made it easy was their work was so self-explanatory. They were extremely sort of vocal about what they believed in. They were not holding back at all. But their publicly available work, their publicly available sort of personality and their body of work was so obvious in what they were trying to say, that I didn't really have to make a big effort in trying to paint them one way or the other. I mean, not that I tried, but even if I had to, I wouldn't have to make a big effort, because I think their political ideologies were very, very crystal clear, and they were not, they had no bones about sort of coming out with it. So my job as a journalist was to be able to try and chronicle what they were doing, rather than going inside that room and sitting in judgment and having a disagreement, then walking out without the story. I think the story is much bigger than what my political beliefs are. And I think as a journalist, I always sort of remember that as a lesson in humility, that it's not us, it's not the journalist who is the story.
Yeah.
The journalist never is the story, right? The story is always bigger than the journalist.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that makes a lot of sense. Like, otherwise, how are you going to like have access to a world like that? Like, what you're talking about is very important. That to be able to understand why they are the way they are, it is important to understand how their world works and their thought process and everything. I just feel like my vantage point would be a little different because a lot of the violence that they are inciting is targeted at the Muslim community. So, I mean, I don't feel very generous.
100%.
And even
But,
though, like,
but even the reporting doesn't condone what they're doing.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that is where your journalism comes into play, right?
Yeah.
You don't just because you tend to look at them as humans, as people with very similar aspirations, with very similar problems. That doesn't mean that you give them a clean chit for what they're doing. And so I've made sure that I don't hold back on that front of putting sort of putting light on what their work is.
Not letting go of the lens of criticality either.
Absolutely not, because I didn't want this book to be something that is a vehicle of this pop culture and propaganda. I wanted this book to be able to tell us what was driving some of this propaganda. And which is why it needed me to not sit back and sort of be in judgment, but be able to tell the story and yet have that lens of criticality where I highlight and where I expose their work to a wider audience.
Yeah. We know that there is a certain incentivization of hate that's happening here, right? There's algorithms that are supporting you to actually make more of this content so you can actually like make money from it. So my question to you is then, how can we hold these platforms accountable for incentivizing hate?
I think we're being very nice to them when we say that platforms are incentivizing hate. I would go a step further and say that platforms are actively funding a lot of hate. Right? They're actively helping produce a lot of this hate. Because if you're a creator who's creating all of these songs or this poetry, and if you're uploading them on YouTube is paying you for it. It's paying you for the number of views that you get. Which is in one way, YouTube telling you that here, take some more money, go and produce better work, go and produce similar work, but maybe better produced. Maybe better production values. Maybe go and record the song in a even more beautiful location somewhere outside, right? So YouTube is essentially telling you, keep doing this, but just get better with it. And I'm here to fund you. Similarly is the case with a lot of audio streaming platforms, where a lot of these songs especially are very freely available. What these streaming platforms are also saying is that it's fine if you do this kind of stuff, we will pay you for it, because people are here to listen to it. So they're ensuring that, there are these channels that pop stars like Kavi Singh can use to be able to get bigger and bigger audiences. But the story doesn't end there, Yusra. What happens then is the online popularity often means that even offline, there are more takers for this kind of music. So, for instance, when Kamal Agne, the poet, he goes to different Kavi Sammelans to perform, he told me how a lot of the organizers of Kavi Sammelans would see how he was doing on YouTube, right? And if he was a viral poet, they would say, "Acha, aap viral ho, you come and perform here." So he would get a bigger deal. So he would get a better pay packet. He would possibly get a more attractive billing. He would get the bigger Kavi Sammelans because he was going viral on YouTube. Now, when he goes to the Kavi Sammelan and performs, the number of people who listen to him are then translating into more followers on YouTube and different social platforms. So the offline and the online are constantly feeding into each other. They're constantly helping each other survive. So which is why I say that the online is a very, very essential tool for all of this Hindutva pop to exist and for it to flourish.
So my final question for you is, I wanted to understand if this popular culture that we have here and which is very prominent in, say, the Hindi-speaking belt in India, does it have a presence in the diaspora? And if it does, like, what does that look like?
I mean, it unfortunately has a very vibrant presence in the diaspora, and we've seen instances where some of the music that we're seeing, that we're talking about, Hindutva music, is often played in events in the diaspora as well. In fact, the book publisher that I talk about in the book, Sandeep Dev, he ships many copies across the world, and he also gets donations from across the world. So there is that patronage that someone like him gets. Even the singers that I talk about, they often speak of how they are invited to different countries to perform. They don't always go for various political reasons and so on. But there is definitely a growing engagement in the diaspora for popular culture, which as I said, I mean, what makes it so easy to sort of sneak in is the fact that it's just a song, it's just a poem, right? So I think increasingly we're going to see that some of this popular culture is going to get very direct patronage from sources abroad.
Even though it's specifically in Hindi, like that does not.
That, I mean, so in some ways, in some places, maybe that would inhibit its reach. But I think Hindi is still a very widely spoken language in the diaspora. So I don't see how that would be an absolute constraining factor, because just in terms of the Kavi Sammelans, there are other poets who I met while I was reporting on the book, who are not always very political sort of poets, but they often get invited to different events abroad. So they were telling me that we get invited to say things in the Gulf, sometimes in the US, sometimes in Canada, wherever the diaspora is a very significant sort of population. So there's already that we're seeing. I think it's a matter of time before some of these pop stars become so significant and popular even in the diaspora that they're invited there for performances, that they get funding, and even now I think. So often what happens is people like Sandeep Dev, for instance, they solicit funds from their followers online. One doesn't always know where the money is coming from, right? And he estimates that he has a significant population of his followers who live abroad, and they are people who support him in all ways. So I mean, I will not be surprised if we only see a greater engagement of the diaspora in promoting Hindutva pop culture, because let's not forget one of the reasons why films like Kashmir Files and Kerala Story became so popular was that the diaspora was so prominent in propping these films up. In fact, in some of these films, I have experienced, through sort of relatives that I have, friends that I have abroad, that there were free screenings of these films that were organized by the Hindu right wing abroad, where people would be called for these screenings. These films would be shown free of cost to them, and then sometimes the director would be flown in and things. So we're already seeing how the diaspora can be weaponized to further the Hindutva project using the pop culture form. And I won't be surprised if this attempt only goes deeper and deeper.
I think fascinating and very, very insidious.
Yeah.
With that, I would like to close this conversation. Thank you so much, Kunal, for taking all the time, and thank you for your work.
Thank you so much, Isra. It's been an absolute pleasure, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.